In episode 59, titled Password Attacks, Spray versus Stuff versus Brute Force, we're focusing on choosing the right password approach based on context, because these techniques can look similar on the surface while carrying very different operational and safety risks. In an assessment setting, the goal is not to hammer until something works. It is to demonstrate realistic credential risk within authorized boundaries while protecting account availability and user productivity. That means you need a clear mental model of what each method is, what signals suggest it is relevant, and how lockout policies and monitoring should shape what you attempt.
These distinctions also show up in exam questions because the right answer is often the one that aligns method choice with safety constraints, not the one that sounds most aggressive. When you can explain the differences cleanly, you can plan responsibly and report credibly.
This episode builds that model step by step. Credential stuffing is trying known username and password pairs across different services based on the idea that users reuse credentials. The key characteristic is that the attacker already has the pairs, often from a prior breach or leak, and the work is to test whether those exact combinations work elsewhere. Stuffing is not about guessing passwords. It is about reusing known combinations at scale, often against login portals that are exposed and easy to automate. In enterprise environments, stuffing pressure is high wherever there are externally reachable authentication surfaces, especially if users have weak password hygiene and if multi-factor protections are inconsistent.
From a testing perspective, stuffing is sensitive because it can trigger account lockouts, alerting, and user disruption quickly if done broadly.
The right way to think about stuffing is reuse of known pairs, which makes it distinct from methods that involve guessing.
Password spraying is a different pattern. It is a small number of guesses across many accounts, designed specifically to avoid lockouts and reduce detection. The attacker chooses one or a few common passwords and tries them against a wide set of users, relying on the probability that some accounts will match weak password choices. Spraying is attractive when the attacker has a large user population and limited insight into individual password quality, because the method trades depth on one account for breadth across many accounts. The hallmark is low frequency per account and a wide distribution across the directory, which is how it slips past lockout thresholds that are configured per user. In assessment logic, spraying is often the technique associated with avoid lockouts because it intentionally stays under per-account attempt limits. The risk is still real because even a single success can become a foothold, but safety planning is crucial because broad testing can still disrupt operations if policies are strict. Brute force is many guesses for one account, and it carries the highest lockout risk because it concentrates attempts against a single identity. In brute force, the attacker targets one account, often a high-value account, and tries to guess the password through repeated attempts. This approach can be effective when lockouts are absent, weak, or disabled, or when the attacker can spread attempts across many sources in a way that avoids detection controls. In most modern enterprise environments, brute force is the least safe approach to attempt in an assessment because it is most likely to trigger lockouts, alerts, and account disruption quickly. It can also create reputational issues for the tester because it looks like reckless behavior if it causes outages or impacts user access. The right mental model is deep guessing on one account, which is exactly the opposite of spraying's shallow guessing across many accounts. Lockout policies and monitoring are what turn these methods from theory into operational decisions, because they determine what is safe and what is irresponsible. If lockout thresholds are low and reset windows are long, even a small number of failed attempts can lock accounts, creating business disruption and potentially impacting critical operations. If monitoring is mature, repeated authentication failures across many accounts can trigger detection and response actions that interrupt the engagement or cause defensive countermeasures. Policies also vary by account type, with privileged accounts often having stricter controls, which changes which identities are safe to test and how. In a professional engagement, you treat lockout and monitoring as constraints that shape your method choice, your rate limits, and your scope. The practical rule is that you never allow testing to become an availability incident, and lockout awareness is central to that. When in doubt, you coordinate and choose the least disruptive proof method.
Signals that suggest stuffing often revolve around exposed portals and evidence of known credential leaks, because those conditions make the method realistic and high probability. An internet-facing authentication portal increases attacker opportunity because it is reachable and can be targeted repeatedly, especially if defenses are weak or inconsistent. Knowledge of credential leaks, whether through internal incident history or external breach context, suggests that reused pairs may exist and that testing reuse is a plausible risk. Another signal is inconsistent multi-factor coverage, where some portals enforce stronger controls while others rely solely on passwords, creating soft targets for reuse attempts. Stuffing is also suggested by detection patterns that show many login attempts across multiple services using the same usernames, which indicates reuse testing rather than guessing. In assessment reasoning, these signals support discussing stuffing risk even if you do not execute broad testing, because the environment conditions align with how the technique is used in the real world.
The important part is tying the method to realistic opportunity, not just naming it.
Signals that suggest spraying often involve large account populations and uncertain password quality, especially in organizations where password hygiene varies widely. A large number of user accounts creates a probability effect, where even if most accounts are strong, some percentage may use weak or predictable passwords.
Uncertain password quality can stem from inconsistent policy enforcement, legacy systems, or cultural patterns that encourage simple passwords for convenience.
Spraying also becomes more plausible when lockout policies are weak or inconsistently enforced, because the attacker can remain below thresholds while still testing many accounts.
Another signal is when authentication telemetry shows low-frequency failures across many accounts rather than concentrated failures against one account, which is consistent with a spray pattern.
In assessment planning, the presence of many accounts does not justify broad testing on its own, but it informs which risks are most plausible and which controls matter most.
The key is aligning the method with the environment's characteristics and constraints.
Now, walk a scenario deciding among the three methods using safety and constraints, because this is where the distinctions become practical.
Imagine you have an externally reachable portal, a clear lockout policy that triggers after a small number of failures, and an engagement scope that permits limited authentication testing only in a controlled window.
You also know that the organization recently dealt with credential reuse issues, but you do not have any actual credential pairs to test. In this scenario, brute force is the wrong choice because it concentrates failures and almost guarantees lockout or alerting for the targeted account. Credential stuffing is also not appropriate as an active method because you lack known pairs, and because broad testing would likely cause user disruption under the strict lockout policy. A carefully constrained spray-like approach could be considered only if explicitly authorized, tightly scoped to test accounts or agreed identities, and executed with strict rate limits and stop conditions. But even then, it may be safer to demonstrate risk through policy review and defensive assessment rather than live attempts. The right decision is usually the one that proves realistic risk while minimizing operational impact and staying inside permissions.
Minimizing harm is not optional, and it is the core of professional credential testing when any of these methods are considered. Rate limits matter because authentication systems and monitoring are sensitive to volume, and slow, controlled attempts reduce disruption risk. Small scopes matter because testing a handful of agreed accounts is different from testing an entire directory, and scope should match authorization and risk tolerance. Authorized methods matter because credential testing can quickly cross ethical and legal boundaries if it affects real users or causes lockouts, so you operate only within explicit rules of engagement. You also define stop conditions, such as halting immediately if you see account lockouts, unexpected authentication behavior, or signs of service instability. The goal is controlled proof of risk, not widespread account impact, and that goal should shape every decision. In practice, the safest approach is often to validate controls and demonstrate how defenses would respond rather than attempting high-impact credential guessing. Pitfalls in this area often come from confusion in terminology and from ignoring lockout rules that exist for good reasons. Confusing spraying with brute force is a common mistake, especially when someone sees many failed attempts and assumes it must be brute force, even if attempts are distributed across many users. Ignoring lockout rules is the more serious pitfall because it can cause widespread account disruptions that harm productivity and damage trust in the engagement. Another pitfall is assuming that a successful login proves a password weakness without considering alternate explanations, such as an already compromised account, shared credentials, or testing against non-production systems. There is also a reporting pitfall where people describe credential testing results without emphasizing constraints and safeguards, making the work appear reckless even when it was controlled. The professional approach is precise language, strict safety planning, and clear documentation of what was attempted and why. When you avoid these pitfalls, you can discuss credential risk responsibly.
Quick wins in defense come from prioritizing strong controls that reduce the success rate of all three methods and improve detection when attempts occur. Multi-factor authentication is one of the strongest mitigations because it breaks the simple password equals access assumption that stuffing and spraying rely on.
Monitoring and alerting tuned for authentication anomalies helps because it can detect patterns like distributed failures or reuse attempts across services without relying on lockouts alone.
Password hygiene improvements matter because strong, unique passwords reduce reuse risk and reduce the probability that a common guess will succeed, which undermines both stuffing and spraying. Account lockout policies and smart throttling can help, but they need to be balanced to avoid denial of service issues against users, so they are not a silver bullet.
The overarching point is that good defenses should reduce attacker success while preserving usability and availability, and that is why layered controls are preferred.
In a test context, highlighting these quick wins gives stakeholders immediate steps that reduce real-world risk. Reporting language should describe method risk and recommended control improvements without making the engagement sound like you attempted to break everything.
You explain what method is relevant based on environment signals, such as the presence of exposed portals, the size of the user population, and the strength of lockout and multi-factor controls. You describe operational risk, including the potential for lockouts, user disruption, and monitoring triggers, which is why controlled scoping and rate limits are required. You recommend improvements that match the method risks, such as expanding multi-factor coverage for exposed authentication surfaces, improving detection for distributed failure patterns, and strengthening password policies and user education. You also document constraints like limited testing windows or restrictions on live authentication attempts, so readers understand what was and was not validated directly. Clear reporting builds trust because it shows you understand both security and operational realities.
The best reports educate stakeholders on the difference between methods while pointing them toward practical mitigations.
To keep the distinction sticky, use this memory phrase: pairs, many users, one user, lockouts.
Pairs reminds you that credential stuffing uses known username and password combinations across services.
Many users reminds you that spraying involves a few guesses distributed across many accounts to reduce lockout likelihood. One user reminds you that brute force focuses many guesses on a single account, making it the most likely to trigger lockouts. Lockouts reminds you that policy and monitoring determine what is safe to attempt and often make active testing risky in production environments.
This phrase helps you classify patterns quickly when you see authentication logs or when you need to choose the correct method in a scenario question.
It also anchors your safety mindset because it keeps lockout risk in the foreground.
To conclude episode 59, titled Password Attacks, Spray versus Stuff versus Brute Force, remember that the right choice depends on context, authorization, and safety constraints, not on which method sounds most powerful. Credential stuffing is trying known username and password pairs across different services to exploit credential reuse. Password spraying is trying a small number of common guesses across many accounts to reduce the chance of lockouts. Brute force is trying many guesses against one account, carrying the highest lockout and disruption risk. When you can restate each method that cleanly and tie it to lockout and monitoring realities, you are ready to choose safely in real engagements and to answer exam questions with disciplined reasoning. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.